I mentioned that Iranians, by and large, think of their history as a great, a great story, largely for three reasons. One is the history of kings, going back to the Achaemenid period. The second reason is Persian poetry or Persian literature, which is one of the glories of world literature. The third one, less appealing to some people, more appealing to others, is a story of Shiite Islam. Today, I want to take up the first two of those, the kings and the poets, because there is something a bit strange about that pairing. The strange thing is that the poetry, the spread of the Persian language, takes place in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, when there are no Persian kings. They're kings, but they're not Iranians. They're primarily Turks and Mongols, whose native language is unrelated to Persian. So it's hard to say that the greatness of the history of kings is paralleled by the greatness of the literature, except insofar as one of the first monuments of Persian literature was the narrative of the story of the kings, written by Ferdowsi right around the year 1000. So the question is, why did the Persian language spread and Persian literature if it was not related to Persian kingship? I also spoke at the very beginning about the Iranian language in the very earliest times, the Proto-Indo-European language, of which a Indo-Iranian subfamily produced two languages that were almost identical except for certain sound changes between them. Avestan, the language of the Zoroastrian holy book, and Sanskrit, or Vedic Sanskrit, language of the Rig Veda in India. This was an enormous spread of language that went all the way through Europe, went all the way through northern India. So there's, the history of the spread of Indo-European languages is one of the most abundantly studied stories of the spread of language over and becoming an overlay of previous languages, although the previous languages in Iran are very, very little known. So there's no problem with the idea that the Persian language would spread, and yet there is something of a problem. And as I started to think about this, I was thinking how it becomes the dominant literary and language in Turkish states to the west, in the Ottoman Empire and its predecessor states in Anatolia, and the language of various Muslim courts, literary circles in South Asia, in what's now Pakistan and northern India, and less surprisingly, in the north, in what's now Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and very broadly in the urban cultures of north of Iran. And yet, nothing in the Arab world. It's as if there's a sort of a carving out of the Semitic language area, Arabic, before that Aramaic, before that Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Canaanite languages. The whole Semitic family occupies what's now we think of as the Arab Middle East. And the Persian language does not spread there in particular. And that struck me as perhaps there's something organic about that. Perhaps there's some sort of difficulty in people who are normally speakers of a Semitic language, which is radically different from Indo-European in language structure, from the Indo-European languages, of which Persian is a particularly important component. But then I thought, that doesn't work, because after the period of Alexander the Great, Greek spread throughout the Arab world, at least that portion of the Arab world that was part of the imperial legacy left at Alexander's death. So that you had people writing in Greek in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, even though they were speaking a Semitic language. So there was no great problem, in fact, with an Indo-European language becoming the language of literature and administrative affairs, court affairs. in the Semitic language area, and yet it didn't happen with the later spread of Persian. Why? Why did Persian not spread into the Arab areas at the same time that it spread into Anatolia and into India? I think one of the answers here is that the spread of the Greek language was very strongly rooted in the actual movement of Greeks into the conquered lands that Alexander had opened up to Greek and Macedonian settlement. So that a city like Antioch, which was a capital for a post-Alexander state in Syria, paralleled by basically Babylon, basically a similar city in Iraq, or Alexandria in Egypt. These were Greek cities, and they had a lot of Greeks living in them, and they were administering to affairs that were centered on the governments in these cities. So it leads to the question as to whether, in order for a language to spread, you have to have the people moving. That would suggest that if that is the case, in the time period I'm talking about, which is basically the late 11th, 12th, and then later after the Mongols in the 13th century. But in that time period, it would suggest that if Persian spread, then Persians must have spread. But they didn't spread to the Arab world so much. All right, that's a hypothesis that one can explore. Is there a difference between how Iranians moved into the Arab world and how many of them, as opposed to which Iranians moved into Anatolia or into northern India? And all of it presumes that there's a large supply of Iranians ready to move. And this, from what I spoke about last time, seems to be appropriate for the late 11th and the 12th century, as things begin to deteriorate in Iran. The agricultural system seems to have deteriorated. I think the climate deteriorated. You have political unrest, particularly in the 12th century, as the Seljuk family dissolves into infighting. So the idea that Iranians were on the move seems to coordinate well with what is happening within Iran. Great cities that I've had a particular interest in, cities like Nishapur and Ray, clearly lost a tremendous portion of their population. This doesn't mean they moved out of the country. They could presumably have moved back into village life, but that seems unlikely. The class of people I've been particularly interested in, the sort of bourgeois civilian elite with very deep and extensive education and commitment to Muslim studies, to Islam as a religion, they were, I think, more likely to move away than to move to a rural home subject to the unsettled nature of the countryside. If we look at the Arab countries, we find a fairly substantial evidence of the movement of this Iranian elite. The story of Islamic educational centers, madrasas, has been, I think, warped by a lack of knowledge about Iranian affairs on the part of people who are primarily historians of the Arab world. General statement that occurred so often in the last generation was that the Persian vizier who worked for Malik Shah and before him Alp Arslan, Nizam al-Mulk, a man from Tus near Nishapur, that he set up a Nizamiya, as it was called, a personally endowed, a large school in Baghdad, and that became the model from which all other schools came. Some people would grant that the Nizamiya in Baghdad was preceded by a Nizamiya in Nishapur. Therefore, this was not something that is suddenly invented in Baghdad. But the Nizamiya in Nishapur was preceded by 1 or 2 dozen madrasas in Nishapur, in and around Nishapur, and in other Iranian cities. In other words, before you get any nizamiyas west of Iran, you have scores of madrasas in Iran. There may be a difference between them. Maybe the Nizamiya was particularly pioneering in providing stipends for students or lodgings or something of that sort, but there's no reason to assume that. And when you look at the spread of the madrasas after the creation of the Nizamiya in the middle of the 11th century in Baghdad, when you look at what happens after that, you find that other madrasas get established in Baghdad. Then they show up in Aleppo, in Damascus, in Egypt, in Mecca, before the coming of the Mongols in 1218, and certainly long before the coming of the Mongol invasion of Hulagu, which culminates in the destruction of Baghdad in 1258. So between 1050 and 1250, before you have powerful presence of the Mongol domination, you have scores of madrasas coming into being in the Arab world, whereas before 1050, you have scores of madrasas already in existence in Iran. I take this as evidence of a spread of an Iranian cultural phenomenon into the Arab world. When one looks at the names of the founders of madrasas, that is to say, of the first professor, you have a surprisingly large number of Iranian names showing up in Syria or in Egypt, suggesting that to establish a school called a madrasa, you needed to have someone who knew what a madrasa was. It's sort of like, how could you establish a Boy Scout troop if you had never experienced a Boy Scout troop? I mean, if you just heard the term, how would you invent it? Because the madrasas of the Arab world are all strikingly similar. They're not all, as some people have argued, schools for the study of law, but because some are specialized. You might have one for the study of medicine, one for Sufism, but they have a physical presence so that the courtyard with arches and cells for the students to live in, that's a fairly standard architectural form. The presence of the madrasas involving Iranians suggests both that they were the people who knew how to organize a madrasa because of their experience in Iran, but also suggests that if you were a religious scholar and therefore someone with really fluent Arabic, you can move into a position of scholarship in the Arab world on a level of parallel status to any of the existing scholars, because the Iranian religious scholars were outstanding. You have other trends that show up in the Arab world that can be traced back to Iran, such as the spread of Ash'ari theology, to some degree the spread of Sufism. I don't want to go into detail on this because that appears to be something that's occurring with an elite group of people, and it does not bring with it the study of the Persian language. Doubtless, if you had an Iranian who established a madrasa in Damascus, he retained his knowledge of Persian, no question about that, but it wouldn't become part of the curriculum of the madrasa, nor would there be any particular audience for any poetry or other writings that person produced. In other words, you get an Iranian influence in the Eastern Arab world, but you don't have all that much evidence of a broad movement of population out of Iran into the Arab world. This appears to be sort of the creme de la creme of the religious elite, that if they have to become refugees, have no difficulty fitting into the society of the Arab world, in the same way that German Jewish intellectuals in the 1930s found that they could come to the United States and be hired by American universities, eagerly hired, because the German university tradition was sort of a model for American scholarship. So there's something different between what happens in Iraq and Syria, in Egypt, and what's happening in Anatolia and in India. The differences are raise the question of why would Anatolia and India both be the recipients of a substantial Persian migration? The common feature that you have in both areas is that these are areas of recent and ongoing conquest and expansion at the hands of Muslim rulers, not Persian rulers, but Muslim rulers. In other words, Mahmud of Ghazna, starting around the year 1000, begins a series of many invasions of northern India that are followed up by members of his descendants, starting from Ghazna in Afghanistan. They're called the Ghaznavids, and then a whole series of principalities in northern India, generally referred to as the Delhi Sultanate, that dominates northern India for centuries. Mahmud of Ghazna was not Iranian. His father was Sebuktakin, was a Mamluk Turkish general, and it is true of most of the rulers of the Delhi Sultanate that they were not Iranians, that they were Turks. Some were Iranians or Afghans, but many were Turks. Similarly, in Anatolia, starting in the late 1000s, you have a collapse of the Byzantine military frontier after the Battle of Manzikert, and the Seljuks and even more Turkish groups that are moving before the Seljuks, perhaps to escape Seljuk domination. They are moving into all of Asia Minor, of Anatolia, so that by the time of the First Crusade, after 1095, 1096, when the Crusaders from Europe cross the Strait of the Bosphorus and find themselves in Asia Minor, the army that they face and have to defeat is a Turkish army, not a Greek army. So, in other words, these two areas are areas of opening up to Islam under the aegis of warlords and conquerors who are able to destroy the existing political structure in both areas. Indeed, it's always struck me as curious that historians have not done parallel histories of northern India and Anatolia, where Turks opened up great spaces for Islam. Instead, they study an Ottoman Empire, a Mughal Muslim empire in India, and a Safavid empire in Iran. But that all starts around 1500 or so, whereas the real spread goes back to the late 1000s, the 1100s. It seems to me that the movement of Iranians into northern India and into Anatolia must have been fairly massive in numbers. And also, the strong likelihood is that it was focused mainly on people who were coming from Iranian cities, not from the Iranian countryside. The everyday Persian of the Iranian villagers does not spread into these countries. What is spread is a literary language. And we see the rise of major poets, particularly Jalaluddin Rumi in Anatolia, later on Amir Khosrow in India, but he has precursors in India. The people who are moving into Anatolia and India are moving into the dominant stratum of urban life that previously had been accustomed to Greek or Armenian or in India, Punjabi or Sindhi. In other words, these local languages continue in the countryside, but in the cities you have a new layer made up of educated Iranians. I cannot put any numbers on this. All I can say is that if you have a poet who today is revered as one of the greatest poets in the world, Jalaluddin Rumi, and he's working in the middle of what is now Turkey, and he's writing in Persian, Who would have read his works? Who would have been his audience if there was not a Persian population? Curiously, the answer to that question by past generations of scholars is often phrased as the Turks preferred the Persian language to their own. I find that absurd. I can't imagine an ethnic group that has its own language that ultimately produces great poetry and great works of literature and scholarship. That sort of the dominant leaders of this group, the Turkic tribespeople who came in to Iran in the 11th century and then spread further. I can't imagine them sort of getting together and saying, you know, Persian is so much better than Turkish. Let us all admire Persian. Where would they have learned the Persian that they admired so much? These were not sophisticated urbanites. These are people who are living in military camps, pastoralists who had horse herds and sheep herds and lived in the country in a nomadic fashion. Where would they have learned this Persian? Why would they come in, sack and loot a great Persian city and then say, gee, that was a great language that all those people we killed spoke. Why don't we adopt that as our favorite language for all sophisticated communication? It makes no sense to say that the Seljuks preferred Persian, as so many historians have said. It makes no sense unless there's an audience. The audience is both the audience who understand Persian and can admire great poetry, but also an audience that is capable of teaching Persian to people who want to be part of the new elite of these new Turkic dynasties. So the spread of Persian, I think, must be underlain by a major spread of Iranian population, but not a folk migration that produces broad areas where Iranians settled as the rural population. In other words, you don't get Iranian villages being set up in Pakistan or Iranian villages getting set up in Anatolia. They have indigenous populations at a village level who speak languages from before their Islamic conquests. So this is part of a migration of urbanites from Iran into urban or semi-urban environments in newly conquered areas. It's not exclusively that, because you also have the establishment of shrines, and often built around the tombs of famous Sufis. And those shrines would be endowed with lands by rulers and members of ruling families who wanted to gain favor with God. And those lands would be farmed by indigenous populations, but also perhaps by some Persian immigrants. So it's not necessarily that all of the Iranian immigrants move into cities, but that's the dominant pattern. In the north, you have where you had Iranian life well before this time. You do see a solidification of Persian, particularly in Uzbekistan, so that the daily language of Bukhara down to the 20th century for most of the people in that major city of Uzbekistan was Persian, even though Uzbek was spoken in the surrounding countryside. I don't know of any way to trace the routes by which Iranians moved, but I would assume that a great many of them moved within the entourage of armies. Armies at this time tended to be mobile camps more than fixed garrisons. In the early Islamic conquests, we note that one of the most important features was to have fixed encampments that grew into be, in many cases, to be great cities. But with the movement of the Turkish tribes, you get a much more of a flux in in the question of where the center of government and the military center is. In other words, the Seljuk sultans, they might rule from a city like Ray or a city like Isfahan or a city like Baghdad. That's ultimately, but you had armies that were on the move, and the soldiery, which would be Turkic speaking, would be buttressed by a large retinue of people who cooked their food, pitched their tents, took care of their horses, and so forth and so on. A tremendous number of services. There have been some studies later on of in the Ottoman period of the ratio between the number of soldiers who actually fought on the battlefield with an army and the size of the support retinue that they brought with them. And it's quite a multiple. The spear point, would be comparatively small with the great retinue behind it. So my guess is that as the Turks became dominant in Iran, and as the future darkened for ordinary Iranians because of the sources of decline that I talked about last time, if you wanted to get on board what was coming along historically, you couldn't join the Turks in the sense of suddenly becoming a member of a Turkish tribe, although there was some bleeding back and forth between nomad and settled in anthropological terms. But there was a lot of money in these Turkish camps. And if you had skills, if you were a craftsperson, to move along with the army would make a great deal of sense. So I think that the Iranian diaspora, as I call it, is primarily a phenomenon that breaks into two components. One component is the movement of largely of urban Iranians into the new conquest areas in Anatolia and northern India, in the train of Turkish armies, so that wherever the army went, there would be some people who were with the army who were Persian speakers. And as these people became assimilated into the urban life in India or Anatolia, in the conquered areas, they would establish a Persian-speaking community, a Persian-speaking society, alongside whatever society was already there, Punjabi or Sindhi or what have you in India, Armenian or Greek in Anatolia. And this would show up in the poetry of someone like Rumi, who clearly recognizes that he has an audience that includes, as I understand it, Greeks and Armenians, Turks. So that's one part of the diaspora. Then the other part of the diaspora is the movement into the Arab world, which I see mostly as an elite movement, in which the religious institutions and areas of thought that had grown up and matured in Eastern Iran, in Khorasan, in the 900s and the early 1000s, they move over into the world of the Arabs, Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad. But they move along with a comparatively small number of elite scholarly refugees who are able to get posts because of their sophistication, both as scholars in Arabic and as conveyors of new ideas relating to Islamic philosophy, Islamic religion, and Islamic institutional forms. So the diaspora is not a simple story, but the result is, of course, marvelous. Persian becomes the court and literary language of northern India for the next several hundred years. It becomes the paramount literary language for the Ottoman Empire for a period, and even down to the end of the empire. Any educated denizen of the Ottoman court in Istanbul would know Persian as well as Turkish. So the whole growth of Persian as one of the world's greatest non-European literary languages. I mean, basically, we're talking about a language in its literary form that's on a par with Japanese, Chinese, Arabic, ultimately Turkish. This growth of the language and the language community is largely made possible by this diaspora. And of course, this makes one think of the comparison but with the era of the Iranian kings, because the Iranian kings ruled in Iraq for several hundred years, first under the Achaemenids, later under the Sassanids. But their language never spread. Even Zoroastrianism, when it spread, as it did to Armenia, it spreads in Armenian more than in Persian. So that there's a disjuncture between the greatness of Iranian history as the tale of Iranian royal dynasties and culminating in what was celebrated back in 1970 or so as the 2500th anniversary of continuous Iranian imperial greatness. That's a story that simply does not fit with the story of the greatness of Persian literature, which is another of the three great hallmarks of Iranian civilization. Now that leaves the third one, Shiism. And in my next talk, I will give you my views on how Shiism came to be the distinctive expression of Iranian history in Iran, but not among Iranians or Persian speakers elsewhere. It becomes almost uniform in Iran, but spotty in Anatolia or in North India. And I'll talk about that next time. Thank you.